My guest today is Jeffrey Tucker, author and founder of the Brownstone Institute. We discuss the West's totalitarian decline, the growing COVID-19 reckoning, and the truth about Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. Jeffrey is one of my favorite writers, and I'm sure by the end of this episode, he'll be one of your favorites too. Stay tuned. Jeffrey Tucker, thank you for talking to me today, sir.
Surely, good to be here.
So I have been following Brownstone ever since you guys popped up. It's funny because I was listening to you in a separate conversation, and you had mentioned that that you had started Brownstone during the COVID pandemic, and I was like, really? It's only been that short a period of time? Because I feel like Brownstone's been something that's been around for a long
Yeah.
time. So what was your motivation behind starting the Brownstone
Well,
Institute?
so many think tanks and research institutes and websites and institutions and magazines failed completely during the COVID period. I mean, let's be clear on what we're talking about here. The greatest experiment in totalitarian control of society on a global level in the history of the world. Nothing like this has ever been done before, ever. Not even Stalin had domestic capacity restrictions and closed the churches. Pardon me, and tried to script all of human interaction, with 6 feet of distance and all this kind of stuff. I mean, we've never seen anything like this, and it was done all over the Western world in complete violation of the Bill of Rights and the normal liberties and law that we had been working for a better part of 1,000 years to erect. So it was clearly a crisis, and National Review supported it. I mean, so many people supported it. Libertarian organizations said nothing. The ACLU said nothing. Because it was done under Trump initially, uh, that side of things was all for it. So it was a shock to me to discover just how broken the ideological infrastructure of society really was, that people just didn't know. They're like, oh, well, isn't this the way you deal with infectious disease? No. Infectious disease has been around since the beginning of time, whenever that was. And most of our bodies are made of pathogens. We're always exposed to infectious disease all the time. There was nothing different about this. And even if there was something different about this, we've never dealt with infectious disease like this. It contradicted at least 100 years of public health experience. I mean, ever since public health was organized in the 1880s to do with the commons and breakouts of cholera, you didn't muscle people on this level in this way to deal with it, especially with the pseudoscience of masking and the arbitrary 6 feet of distance and the plexiglass we wear and dousing ourselves with hand sanitizer, which we know for sure would make you sicker. So I was shocked at just the intellectual failure, and then I was also mentally dealing with the issue of, like, how do we recover from this? We have unknowns we're faced with from the collapse of public health, the inflation, the economic issues, cultural issues, not to mention vaccine injury. So, there's just so much to do to figure out what happened and what to do about it now. And I didn't see any other institution devoted to that. So I started Brownstone with the goal of bringing together people from all different ideological orientations and also professions, lawyers and writers and journalists and scientists, just to address this subject and to rebuild the foundations of human liberty and human rights. That was the number one goal, and that was in the spring of 21. Um, and and people told me at the time, they said, "Well, this is dumb because COVID's ending, and then there won't be anything to discuss." Well, I there's I've got more to discuss, and I don't know what to do. And so it turns out that Brownstone has become, I would say, a central place for the entire planet Earth. I mean, we're translated into 26 languages for examining what happened and what to do about it now.
Yeah, and so that brings me to my next topic. You wrote a piece a few days ago titled "A Nation of Non-Compliers." For people watching this, the link is in the description. It is, in my opinion, the perfect essay. As an essayist myself, I read a lot voraciously, and your essay just blew everything out of the water. You talk about the the opaque nature of they. Who are they, right?
Yeah.
At the end of your piece, and I wanted to ask you, in your view, do you have an idea of who they are?
So you're asking me a question I've been thinking about for better part of 4 years, and I'm not sure that I'm closer because than I ever have been, because every time somebody pops up that is blamed for everything, and you look closely at their works, you realize, oh, this guy's an idiot. I mean,
Hmm.
it can't be true. So Klaus Schwab is a clown. Bill Gates is a fool. I guess those are kind of top two um, claims. The pharmaceutical companies are in the running for sure, but that doesn't explain how the pharmaceutical companies got hold of the national security state, which was intimately involved. So I I don't think we have yet a sense. I think it has something to do with national security
Mhm.
and the CIA. But by their nature, those are secretive organizations, and everything's sort of classified as associated with it. And I assume that's one reason we have a hard time figuring out who they is, because it's all it's all guarded secrets, and it's so guarded that hardly anybody really wants to talk about it. We have a, a constellation, and by constellation I mean, like, you look up in the sky, you see a bunch of stars, but if you squint and look the right way, you can see shapes of stars and you can turn them into figures. That's sort of what we have with the COVID response. We have constellations, but we have to be careful not to just imagine things that aren't there, too. But one thing we have learned is that deep state actors, especially the national security state, are much more involved in civilian life and the construction of the sort of narratives of control and the public mind than we ever knew. Um, I feel naive for not having known this in the past, but uh, the CIA has a desk for the right, for the left, for the libertarians, for everything,
Mhm.
and um, they pick popular media venues and figure out ways to infiltrate them. This is their job. This is all they do, and these are pretty smart people. So I think it has something to do with that. Let me just say that a story of the COVID pandemic response that doesn't address this elephant in the room is certainly incomplete.
Yeah. Um, so I have an idea of they, and I want to pose it to you, and you tell me what you think. I think one of the theys is communist China. And the reason why I think they're one of the theys is because I saw the Mao brand of Marxism being piped into North American culture around 2010. I've read extensively about history. That's most of my reading. And what I think they did was I think they slowly introduced a cultural revolution. I think the people behind everything we're seeing, they went on the Mao, they used the Mao model, but they understood that Mao's model was backward, and that's why it didn't work completely. Mao did his great leap forward first, and then introduced his cultural revolution. But by that time, so many people were starving to death or dead that the general public consciousness was too weak to really accept the brainwashing.
Mm.
So what I think they did was they switched the order. They introduced our cultural revolution first, and now as we're seeing, a great leap forward is slowly being introduced under the cover of climate change. That's just my hypothesis and my idea. But it too closely resembles Maoism to ignore.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think that's entirely crazy. I'll just give you an example of this. The idea of social distancing. 2 days ago, Fauci was dragged for a subcommittee at the House of Representatives and asked about where this idea of 6 feet of distance came from. And he said, well, I don't really know. It just kind of appeared. Oh, okay, great. Anthony Fauci. And Redfield said that they were just discussing it on our elevator and somebody suggested it and it kind of stuck. Okay. Um, and I had written about the history of social distancing according to an account I read in the New York Times, which has become very mainstream, which was that it came about in 2005 with a paper by a scientist at Sandia National Laboratory who got the idea from his daughter, who was afraid of cooties, and he wrote up a model how you can stop an infectious disease by having everybody stand apart. And that's what in my book, Liberty Lockdown, that's what it says. But my friend and writer for Brownstone, Michael Sanger, went one step further and discovered that this exact model for disease control was deployed by the CCP in 2003 and 2004 for SARS-1. So that is a very interesting template for how SARS-2 was handled. What comes out of SARS-1, it sounds like SARS-2, right? So it makes sense. This was 2003, 2004. SARS hit China and Singapore, and then a few cases in Canada. It was quite deadly. And one of the reasons it didn't spread was because it was deadly. Like a pathogen needs to be widely, in order for a pathogen to be widely transmissible, it needs not kill its host. This is why these things tend to be self-limiting. So that which is very deadly, like Ebola, just doesn't spread very far. And that which spreads very far tends to not be very deadly. There's an inverse relationship between severity and prevalence. Subject, of course, to the condition of latency, which is how long you carry the virus with you before, how long you're infectious before you're symptomatic. Okay, so, but a coronavirus like this is going to be have a latency of a typical flu or any other cold, which is to say, you'll probably be infectious 2 or 3 days before you begin to feel symptoms, and then your ability to spread the virus is going to stop 2 or 3 days before your symptoms are entirely gone. Okay, so that's the usual, and it turns out that's exactly what the case is with SARS-2. But with SARS-1, the World Health Organization got really involved. In fact, the EU spent billions of dollars preparing for a pandemic outbreak of SARS-1. And the World Health Organization was all over it, and they China imposed social distancing and did all these things. And SARS went away. I mean, it seemed to be stopped. And rather than observe that a pathogen like SARS-1, that it was as deadly as it was, I mean, it was like, let's say, I don't remember the numbers, but quite intense severity, like 5% case fatality rate, that sort of thing, quite high. Um, the World Health Organization credited itself with stopping the disease rather than just observing that it was self-limiting. And that lesson stuck over the course of 16 years. So there was a widespread impression. In fact, everybody in public health has ever since then congratulated the glories of the CCP for stopping SARS-1, the CCP and World Health Organization. And you can read it on the website. The World Health Organization gives and takes credit for having stopped this pathogen. So that set up a kind of an awkward situation. So when SARS-2 came out, which they were convinced was a bioweapon from a US funded lab in Wuhan. So how do we do with it? Well, let's go back to how the CCP dealt with SARS-1, and they just copied that model. That's what actually happened. So that wouldn't surprise your theory. I don't think is entirely implausible. But certainly the pandemic response itself was copied directly from China. I mean, in on February 16th, 2020, Fauci's chief assistant named Clifford Lane boarded a chartered flight along with public health officials from the World Health Organization, the UK, and the UN to Wuhan. And they went on a junket that lasted from about February 16th to February 24th, during which time they made a 5-city tour and hosted by the CCP, and said, "Look, we welded everybody into their apartments. We made everybody stay inside, and look, the virus disappeared." So this junket, these people on this junket were very impressed. They said, "Oh, good point. This is really nice." And on the way home in the chartered flight, they typed up a report about the glory of the lockdowns in China, which the World Health Organization published on February 26th. And that was about the time when Fauci flipped and decided that he would support lockdowns. And then it was just 2 weeks later, basically, that the US locked down.
Yeah. And, and so, to that, it's I mean, I think we've become increasingly aware of China's involvement with the World Health Organization in terms of funding and influence. And it seems like, this World Economic Forum, as time goes on and the more people I talk to and the more I think about it, they just seem to me like to be a front organization. I mean, you're absolutely right in your assessment of Klaus Schwab. He's a clown. He's almost casted for the role that he's in, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he's your perfect German, evil supervillain. And that's why I don't really believe anything that comes out of his mouth, mostly because he just doesn't seem to be that bright of an individual to begin with. He seems to be a puppet. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about the they. Who are the they? And it's difficult to answer that question because when you attempt it, you find yourself kind of going down a rabbit hole into
Yeah.
secret societies and Club of Rome and
Right.
banking families and so on and so
Oh
forth.
yeah, yeah, and these theories get they're not entirely wrong, but they tend to get carried away with detail and not enough explanation of causation. I'm on the phone all the time with people saying, "Oh, you're missing the role of so and so and this or that," and they will burn up my phone for a long time, telling me the details of these things, but. This is quite often the way conspiracy theories work. It's like too much in the weeds and not enough big theory. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which uh, people who seem to be central actors in this turn out to be proximate actors. I would say that's, like big tech and even pharma. Like once it became clear we're going to lock down and there was going to be some great reset, um, they just all grabbed hold of it, just like the politicians did, and they spent and just like the Fed did, cranking up 40% increase in the money supply over the course of just 2 years. Um, Everybody was grabbing a piece of the pie, that was being baked at the time. So, but that doesn't mean they put it in the oven. They just grabbed a piece once it came out. So, but there are a lot of bad actors out there, many bad actors, big tech, the media, you know, and pharma and government, and especially the administrative state.
Yeah, and there are a lot of elements to this that feel like it was designed for a specific intended purpose, right? And again, this is venturing further into speculation, but if you look at where we landed in the world that we exist within now, I mean, it's a stark contrast to the world that we were in, 2018. And so it feels like in a lot of ways, a lot of what happened was calculated or predetermined. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this. The World Bank predicted another slow year for global economic growth, which would make this the fifth year in a row and the worst period since the 1990s. Um, how valid, in your opinion, is that prediction? And do you think they're on the nose, or is it worse than what they've stated?
Well, people keep wondering if we're going to be able to soft land this. I think we're asking the wrong question. I mean, the question is, did we ever even take off after March 2020? And I think the answer is no. I mean, we've experienced a dramatic declines in our standard of living and growth rates ever since March 2020. And I think I mean, there's enough error in the data collection. And people aren't even picking up the phone anymore. It's hard to collect data when people don't answer questions, and
Right.
and people are not answering questions anymore. So, my best guess is that we've never had a recovery, and that we're going to do a continued slow sink into oblivion. I mean, the inflation numbers for December just came out, and they were shocking. Actually, we're at 3.4% for the year, and now that's almost twice the Fed target. But what's interesting about that is that nobody expected it. Even I didn't expect it. I had seen plenty of prices being on the downswing
Mhm.
at things you buy all the time at the grocery store. But as I think about it, I'm realizing, okay, that's mainly vegetables. Okay, well, vegetables are down in December and January.
Mhm.
Everything else is higher. So, inflation is still terrible, and velocity is on the rise, which gives upward pressure to prices. So, and money supply is increasing again, incredibly. So, it's not clear. We're through this. We've at least lost 20 cents on the dollar of purchasing power since 2020, but maybe more. But it's going to continue like this, I think that's a good scenario. I mean, if we can avoid a full scale financial crisis, that would be a great thing, actually.
Yeah, it's actually incredible to hear you say that because I thought we were going in a different direction, and you're actually giving me a little bit of hope because I'm in Canada, and here it feels like we are experiencing a controlled economic demolition. I
Yeah,
mean, it feels like there's some sort of goal to all this because
yeah,
it's hard to believe that our government, and I think you guys are experiencing the same thing in the US. It's hard to believe that our institutions are as incompetent as they are.
yeah. Um, you know, I think in August of 2020, Fauci wrote an article for the journal called Cell, in which he imagined reversing 12,000 years of human history, in which we don't go on vacations, we don't gather in groups, we don't live in cities in crowded conditions, we don't um, host parties, we don't shake hands, we don't own pets. Uh, we forage for our food, and the population is dramatically lower. New York Times uh, wrote an article claiming that over the next, I don't know, 100 years or something like that, the population is going to decline by 90%. So um, I think this is probably what they have in mind. I mean, these people are crazy people. But whether they can get there or not is another question. I mean, one of the big problems they have with is the non-compliance, right? I mean, people have largely ignore the signs and the mandates these days. But also the products that they've been putting out are not performing well in the market, from EVs to Mark Zuckerberg's Threads to uh, fake meat. Nothing's really working
Yeah.
in a market sense. So that's a major problem. I mean, we have remnants of capitalism still left in the system, and people don't like what the World Economic Forum is selling. So, and the U.S. anyway, DEI and ESG standards, all these things seem to be a little bit on the ropes. So they may have pushed it as far as they possibly can. That doesn't see. Here's the problem, though. I don't want to get too celebratory about our victories because the bad guys treat our victories as temporary setbacks. They're absolutely determined to achieve this. They have this view that we should not ever be using fossil fuels, that everything should be powered by wind and water and sunbeams, and and that modern life as we know it is wasteful and disease ridden and really has to go. So this is what they think. I've called it techno primitivism as their ideology. It's extremely creepy because it's not quite socialism, and it's not fascism, and it's certainly not capitalism. It's something else. They have a whole series of industries that they want to run the world, and there are new industries, uh, tech and data, and renewable energy sources and this sort of thing. They want all these, and the people who make um, uh, solar panels and wind turbines and these kinds of things. They want them to get all the money in the future and to take it away from oil companies, fossil fuels, and ranchers and that sort of thing. So this is their goal. And if you read Klaus Schwab's book, that's what he imagines. It's not a world of socialism. It's a world of corporatism where his favorite industries get all the money. So that's where they're driving us with the central bank digital currencies and so on. That's where they want us to go. But the masses of people are pushing back in ways they never expected, by the way. So this is really the important thing. we've got an angry public, basically all over Europe, UK, Canada, and US, all Commonwealth countries. People are extremely mad. They're mad about the vaccine mandates and the vaccine injuries, but more than that, it's now obvious that the elites are trying to take away from us our gas cars and our hamburgers.
Yeah.
So you've got people extremely upset and very suspicious and angry at the national media and angry at big tech and angry at the politicians. We're seeing resignations all over the Western world from public health. People are fleeing, so it's not working, and the world really is on fire with all the wars and so on. Everything's broken these days, and somebody broke it, and this is why populism is gaining such traction, politically, all over the world. I worry about this populism because I don't think it's very ideologically focused or philosophically sophisticated, but it is full of rage, real rage, like we've
Yes.
never seen before, and that's got to have some consequences. I mean, totalitarianism is not a very viable system unless people believe it. You know, that's when it really works, is when the masses of people are on board with it. But if you've got a tiny, tiny number of people trying to manage a world population of 8 billion people who are non-compliant, it's very likely not going to work. How that pans out in history, we don't really know yet because we've never faced anything like this. We've never seen a case of basically kind of a revolutionary situation taking place in Western industrialized democracies before. We don't know what that looks like. We know what it looks like in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but we don't know what it looks like in Canada, Australia, and the US and the UK. So we're about to find out though. And it's going to be interesting to watch because there's not going to be any closing this Pandora's box that was opened with lockdowns. It's got everybody absolutely crazy. And by the way, this is intensifying. It's not as if people are going back. This is where the mistake was when people told me I shouldn't start Brownstone because this is all going away. I knew it wasn't going away. If anything, it's getting much more intense. There's more interest in our content than ever before. We have more and more people realizing they're sold a bill of goods. They're furious. I mean, they played games with our health and our lives. I mean, that's and the children, right? And close their schools for 2 years. You can't do that and expect it to just vanish, or expect there to be a widespread amnesty and life goes on. That doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I talked to Dr. Malone just a few days ago, and I asked him about who's going to be the fall guy for this because it seems like the walls are closing in. Anthony Fauci was back, being interrogated again, and of course, it was behind closed doors, and we don't have access to a lot of what was said there. But it seems like they're starting to set people up for a fall. I mean, do you see that happening?
Yeah, well, they're going to, yeah. So the way this works is that you have to feed the masses. You have to get somebody's head on a platter,
Hmm.
and it's a dispute about who that's going to be. But the way they treated Sam Bankman-Fried is a good example, right? I mean, he wasn't supposed to get in any trouble whatsoever, but they made him spend a few months in jail, and now and they dropped the most severe charges, but he'll have to pay some price because the masses need some kind of limited hangout. So it could be that Fauci will be the guy. By the way, Fauci is one of the most hated people in the whole federal bureaucracy. I mean, everybody despises this guy. All the scientists at academia and the nonprofits, they all hate him. He's had too much power for too long, and they hate having to be nice to an asshole for decades. They're really mad about it.
Yeah.
So you've seen hints along the way over the last couple of years that he's it, that they're going to tag him and get rid of him. So and he's quite old, so that works for them.
Yeah.
Like, okay, let's throw this guy on the bus and then hope everybody's satisfied with that. But I don't think it's going to work because there were so many people involved at so many levels. Um, and it's very interesting the way all this is playing itself out. I mean, in the U.S. case, Trump was the guy who greenlighted all the lockdowns, and so, but he doesn't want to talk about that. he, before going into interviews, he makes sure that his role in the lockdowns are not discussed at all. And he's never provided an accounting for what actually happened in the days between March 16th and March 10th and March 16th. He's never really explained that. He just pretends like it doesn't matter. So he's trying to make sure this is not discussed, and that's why he's not debating DeSantis and Haley and Ramaswamy, because he doesn't want this subject coming up. He needs his followers to believe that he's the good guy, right? And
Mhm.
so, and same with the left. The left has always been about freedom and civil rights and free speech and that sort of thing. Well, they turned their backs on all those ideals, completely, and threw themselves into a corporatist racket, and they don't want to discuss it either. So, it really is up to us to keep the subject going, to keep doing the research, keep publishing our stuff, keep doing our podcasts. And that's why we're getting so much attention. I mean, they can't shut us all up. And the thing is that we're growing in numbers
Mhm.
uh, every day. I mean, when I first started this anti-lockdown stuff, it was back in, from day one, in the middle of March 2020, but I was completely alone, and I was for the better part of a year. I mean, there are a few others, but now, I mean, there's hordes of people that are furious about this. I
Yeah,
didn't like it.
yeah, I'm here. I like for me, I relaunched this podcast, back in October because there aren't enough voices in Canada.
Yeah,
There's a very small handful of us, and I thought, you know what, somebody needs to start talking because what we're experiencing up here, I feel like we are ground zero for whatever insane ideas are going to be applied to other Western countries just months or even years down the road. So I felt like we kind of have a responsibility to tell everybody what's happening here because it's scary. I mean, with the carbon taxes, I
oh
mean,
yeah.
today we had a cold snap. I'm in Alberta. We are currently at negative 26 degrees Celsius, negative 40 degrees with the wind chill. And, I, for myself, I'm middle class. My family's comfortable. We can turn on the heat without much worry. But, I, on days where it's negative 10, negative 20, I leave the furnace off because of the carbon taxes. And I think about people who may not be as fortunate as us financially.
Sure.
Um, I mean, the uh, having a $400 utility bill when it's negative 30 degrees outside, that's a death sentence for
Hmm.
some people. And so I know you got to get running here. So I just want to ask you one final question, but before we conclude, you talked about populism and I've always been a believer in good populism. I think there's good populism and bad populism.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, Trump, the way that he campaigns and the way that he talks is exactly what you described. It's rage based, it's anger, it's hate. It's he alludes to revenge on the people who are indicting him and
Yeah.
vindictiveness. And then you have Robert Kennedy Jr., who I think is on the side of good populism.
Hmm.
He speaks directly to the people, but he clearly has a vision and he clearly knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Now, the United States is in a precarious position right now politically. This is one of the most interesting political periods in the U.S. in my lifetime. You have an incumbent who is, I mean, for lack of a better word, brain dead. He's not there, right? And you have Trump, who is on his way to try to reclaim the White House, and then you have Robert Kennedy Jr., who, in my opinion, is the most viable candidate for president that the U.S. has had in a long time, running as an independent. Um, do you have any view on how this plays out over the next 6 months?
I know there's a chance for RFK politically, which is saying something because uh, Canada has a parliamentary system so that minority voices can get a voice in government, but the U.S. has a winner-take-all system, in all elections, House, Senate, presidency. So what that means is that it becomes very difficult for anything but the two parties. Uh, what people do when they vote is not to vote for the person they want, they vote against the person they fear the most. So you might love RFK. And in fact, 80% of voters might love RFK, but if you fear Biden, you're going to vote for Trump, even if you hate him. Or if you fear Trump, you're going to vote for Biden, even if you hate him. Um, this just the logic of political choice. The law is called Duvenger's law, but it's in any democratic elections where it's a winner take all system. It will ultimately default to two choices. So it would have to be pretty unusual circumstances for RFK to be able to cut through that. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I think it's fairly unlikely. And that's really tragic because, and also the U.S. is a lot like Canada in the sense that our big cities dominate the political environment. I mean, you say you live in Alberta. I mean, as far as I know, Alberta is almost universally, what we in the U.S. would call red
Yeah.
zone. I mean, like nobody likes your prime minister, whoever his name is. I forget
Oh,
his name.
Danielle Smith, but
Oh
just
no, she's great.
oh,
I'm talking
oh, you mean
about
Justin Trudeau? Yeah,
Justin
yeah,
Trudeau. Like everybody hates this guy, right? But it has no effect in Canada. So it's very similar in the US. So the big cities, like nobody likes Biden, but the big cities will vote for him because they hate Trump. So um, it's a problem. The other thing that's very interesting in the US right now is we had a ton of people from so-called blue states move to red states, which over the next 5 or 10 years is going to dramatically change the political balance of power in the US. And that's the reason for the migrant crisis. They're importing voters from all parts of the world and shoving them in the cities as fast as they possibly can. You can vote generally in federal elections as a undocumented alien. As incredible as that is, I mean, you just can't even believe that's true, but it really is true. So they're importing voters and to counteract these trends otherwise. And I tell you what, you cannot um, overestimate the significance of the migrant crisis for the U.S. Uh, political temperature right now. People are beyond furious, whether it's in New York or Texas or anywhere. People are just losing their minds about millions upon millions and millions of people just pouring in. I mean, it feels like the country is being sacked, you know,
mm,
and um, and that's the kind of stuff that makes people just crazy, just crazy. And libertarians always underestimate this because we generally like immigration. We're like, oh yeah, immigration's great. But for regular people, to crash your political system by these alien invaders by the millions who do no work, live on welfare, and nonetheless get to vote in your elections, that is really playing with fire. So we'll see how it pans out.
yeah. And just to mention one thing before we go, in Canada, we actually with Justin Trudeau in our last election, he won a minority government, and to save himself from a vote of no confidence from our Conservative Party, he created a coalition government with our NDP party, which is our socialist party, and that's how we ended up with him. We're locked into a government we didn't vote for.
Yeah, it just doesn't work, does it? There's so much broken about politics in the world. So far in human history, we've not really figured out how to put together a very large government that is also responsive to the people. Those two things have never really go together. So the only real way we have to understand, how to limit government is just to make sure it's just tiny and as irrelevant as possible. I mean that, but we're so far from that at this point.
Yeah.
That's a system that used to be called liberalism. I mean, that was it was started to be born at the Magna Carta, came to fruition in the Enlightenment, was president of the American Revolution. Those are the ideals that we have to recapture. And there's no shortcuts to get there. It's not about getting, the right person in office. What we need to do is dramatically somehow figure out a way to dramatically diminish the power of government and to make it impossible for even bad guys to get control of it and wreck society again. That's the
Yeah.
agenda. How we get from here to there, I don't know, but it has something to do with popular opinion. That much I'm sure.
Yeah. And I I went into 2020 a liberal and came out a more of a libertarian myself. Just kind of seeing the shortcomings in these political ideologies, right? And
Yeah,
libertarianism seems to be more appealing nowadays than anything because I think we're
sure.
starting to see the danger in being on a team, so to say, on the right or the left, right? And
Yeah.
so, Jeffrey Tucker, thank you so much for your time. Can you tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah, I write every day for Epoch Times, and then more recently, almost every day for Brownstone. So that's really just 2 articles a day. So you can get sick of me if you want. You can certainly get sick of me if you want. I'm sick of me, but and I do appreciate it when people go to brownstone.org and subscribe to our emails. We send one a week.
Yes, I'm on that list myself. So, for everybody watching, I want to just highly recommend Jeffrey's Nation of Non-Compliers essay. It is in the description below. Please read it. Please read Jeffrey's work. You're one of my favorite writers, and as a writer, it's such an honor to talk to a guy I look up to. If this was a different conversation, I would have asked you about your process for an hour and bored everybody to death. So yeah, yeah, that thank you so much for your time, Jeffrey. I really
It's a
appreciate it.
pleasure. Thank you for taking the time. All the best.